Good morning. My name is Dave Eberth. I'm one of the research scientists here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, and welcome to another in the 2016 speaker series. Sponsored by the Royal Tyrrell Museum Cooperating Society, the speaker series is free and open to the public. Today we're going to leave what I call the familiar trenches of scientific research, and we're going to explore the sometimes turbulent intersection of science and religion. So put on your seatbelts. Although the Tyrrell Museum is an internationally recognized scientific research, science education, and science outreach facility, we all too often take for granted what constitutes science, how it is done, how it is perceived. We also rarely discuss how good science is separated from bad, or how we recognize and refute pseudoscience masquerading as science. These topics are particularly important to all of us here at the Tyrrell Museum as well as other science facilities, because here we focus on Earth's multi-billion-year history of change and associated biological evolution, and we do that through the lens of science. And as you all know, we sometimes encounter those who reject or misrepresent our findings because those findings conflict with their deeply held religious beliefs. It's just a fact of our business. Accordingly, it's really important that science facilities like the Tyrrell Museum be clear not only about our scientific conclusions, but also how we arrive at those conclusions, how science actually works, and how to recognize and address negative influences on science. So today, we'll be hearing from Christine Shellska. Chris is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Communication, Media, and Film at the University of Calgary. Her research involves the study of rhetorical strategies employed by the intelligent design creationism movement, and all considered within the history, philosophy, and sociology of science and rhetoric. She has a background in marketing and advertising that provide her with a unique perspective on the topic, and I ask you to consider the concept of creationism meets Mad Men to get that across. She is also a regular co-host on the Calgary-based Legion of Reason podcast, is president of Atheist Alliance International, and is on the board of directors for the American Humanist Association. The title of Chris's talk today is The Rhetoric of Intelligent Design. Please welcome Chris Shellska.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and to everybody for showing up, and thank you very much for hosting me, Dr. Eberth, and also thank you for the introduction, so I'll just skip this slide. So today I'm going to talk about how creationists and some of their successors have used rhetoric to challenge science. I'll begin by describing the latest manifestation of creationism, intelligent design. Then I'll outline some of the rhetorical theories I'm using for my analysis, which focuses on three debates: Bill Nye versus Ken Ham, Christopher Hitchens versus William Lane Craig, and Deepak Chopra and Jean Houston versus Michael Shermer and Sam Harris. I began my studies by exploring the term intelligent design, or ID. The organization primarily responsible for deploying this term, the Discovery Institute, is a think tank based out of Seattle, Washington. Under the project name the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture, they drafted a public relations plan entitled the Wedge Strategy, which got leaked onto the internet in 1999. Basically, their goal is to defeat materialism, and I'll expand on that in a bit as we proceed here. And they also want to replace these materialistic explanations with theism. They want to see ID theory as a dominant scientific perspective. Now, obviously, this hasn't happened. But they do want to see ID theory permeate pretty much every aspect of our lives. And part of their plan was to engage influential people like academics, politicians, and the media. And they've been incredibly successful with that. Part of their mandate involves shaping popular opinion And Gallup polls show that belief in creationism continues to flourish in the U.S. The most recent polling from 2014 indicates that 42% of Americans believe God created man in present form, 31% believe man developed with God guiding the process, and only 19% believe man developed but God had no part in the process. Fortunately, the Canadian context is a little different. According to an Angus Reid public opinion poll conducted in 2011, only 22% of Canadians believe God created human beings in their present form within the last 10,000 years, while 61% of us believe human beings evolved from less advanced life forms over millions of years. Nonetheless, Canada has seen some penetration of this idea into our cultural lives, and so too have parts of Europe, Australia, and we've even seen some of the same arguments deployed by Muslim apologists. So how did the term intelligent design emerge? I won't go into details about the Scopes monkey trial because I think most of you will probably be familiar with it. The trial took place in Tennessee back in 1925, and substitute teacher John Scopes was fined $100 for teaching evolution instead of Christian creationism, but the case was later dismissed on a technicality. Then in 1968, in Epperson versus Arkansas, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that banning the teaching of evolution violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which opens with the line, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Another significant trial was held in 1987. In Edwards versus Aguillard, Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist ruled that teaching creationism in public schools was a violation of the Establishment Clause because it promotes a sectarian view of religion. It was during this trial that creationist Dean Kenyon testified that, quote, "biomolecular systems require intelligent design." And in 1989, the term intelligent design enjoyed its publication debut in the second edition of a high school creationist biology textbook entitled Of Pandas and People, which Kenyon co-authored. In 2007, philosopher Barbara Forrest's research revealed that the text was hastily rewritten after using a word processor search and replace technique, and an unfortunate mixing of the terms creationists and design proponents gave rise to the now infamous term seed design proponensis. The most recent U.S. case involving ID in public schools was Kitzmiller versus Dover in 2005. As expert witnesses for the plaintiffs, Forrest and her colleagues' testimony played a substantial role in revealing ID's creationist roots. And in a scathing decision, Judge John E. Jones III concluded that teaching ID as science is unconstitutional, stating that, quote, "This case came to us as a result of the activism of an ill-informed faction on a school board aided by a national public interest law firm eager to find a constitutional test case on ID, who in combination drove the board to adopt an imprudent and ultimately unconstitutional policy. The breathtaking inanity of the board's decision is evident when considered against the factual backdrop, which has now been fully revealed through this trial." So that's a bit of background on how the term came into being. Essentially, intelligent design is creationism rebranded in an attempt to rhetorically uncouple itself from its Christian heritage, and the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture was set up to do exactly that. Despite Judge Jones's ruling, attempts to keep creation in public school science classrooms or to teach ID as a viable theoretical alternative to evolution remain ongoing. I mentioned earlier that I go into a bit more detail on materialism, and I apologize to the philosophically inclined out there because I'm going to simplify things quite a bit. But broadly speaking, the word has basically two meanings. One is philosophical. It's a belief that all that exists is composed of matter and energy. Those who hold this belief reject the existence of a metaphysical or supernatural realm. The other meaning pertains to method. Methodological materialism informs the scientific method, and since science focuses on the natural world, it is not concerned with investigating metaphysical and supernatural claims, because those are outside its sphere of inquiry. This is the main reason why ID is rejected by the mainstream scientific community. Invoking the supernatural to explain the natural world is simply not science. It's basically saying God did it, and if we're satisfied with that answer, then basically we might as well shut down the entire endeavor and be done with it. But some of us are not satisfied with that answer, and that is why we have places like CERN and this museum, where we celebrate the findings of science and those who contribute toward our understanding of reality, and to embrace the unanswered questions their findings continue to generate. But ID proponents cast the word materialism into a different rhetorical framework to attack evolution. Even though Darwin's theory was famously confirmed in 1953 with the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA by Watson and Crick, it continues to be further corroborated among various scientific fields, including biology, paleontology, geology, astronomy, and so on. And it is held to be uncontroversial by the mainstream scientific community. The mechanism Darwin proposed, natural selection, contradicts the biblical view that humans were divinely created. Darwin did not look beyond the material realm to explain how life developed. He did not invoke God as an explanatory mechanism. He practiced methodological naturalism. ID proponents, however, define materialism ideologically, claiming that its theoretical uptake and appropriation during the later 19th century by intellectuals such as Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, and Karl Marx has tainted Western civilization, spawned moral relativism, and removed personal accountability. For example, they frequently link the theory of evolution to scientific and political practices such as eugenics and Nazism to support their arguments. Incidentally, this rhetorical tactic is known as Godwin's Law, a phrase coined by Mike Godwin in 1990, which states, quote, "As an online discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving Nazis or Hitler approaches 1. And this seems to hold even more true today. Because ID proponents understand materialism from this ideological stance, they view it as a threat to their belief that humans are privileged above other forms of life and progressing towards spiritual perfection. So I hope that summarizes for you what intelligent design is and gives a bit of a background on how and why the term came into being. The rhetorical strategies the Discovery Institute uses is a study unto itself, but the focus here is on debates. Before I proceed, though, I'll give a bit of an overview on some of the classical and contemporary rhetorical theories I'm using to inform my analysis. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, and this is probably of a review for a lot of you, but I want to acknowledge Aristotle, who wrote a book called On Rhetoric, A Theory of Civic Discourse, and that work remains relevant today. Aristotle defined rhetoric as the art of persuasion, and he identified 3 means of persuasion. Ethos refers to the character of the speaker, logos appeals to logic and reason, and pathos appeals to the emotions. He also identified a number of logical fallacies that remain relevant today, although there have been a few added along the way, and I'd count Godwin's Law among those. Aristotle's insights have been expanded upon by his many successors who have studied rhetoric through different social, political, and historical contexts. One of these is Lloyd Bitzer, who focuses on the rhetorical situation. That is, a set of circumstances that morally compels a rhetor to respond. A situation is rhetorical if participation in its discourse can alter social reality. The situation is the site of rhetorical analysis, like our debates, and rhetoric is understood as a response to and controlled by the situation. The analysis takes into account the exigence or problem. The audience is brought together by the exigence and conceived of as agents for social change. In this case, the exigence is the tensions between science and religion. It also takes into account constraints. Quoting Bitzer, these include beliefs, attitudes, documents, facts, traditions, images, interests, motives, and the like, and some of these can be controlled and harnessed by the rhetor. The concept of translation offers insight into the rhetorical process of expanding networks by engaging actors. This concept comes from actor network theory, or ANT, which sees knowledge as a product of network relations among human and non-human actors. ANT theorists trace the nodes or actors in a network to identify the associations that constitute knowledge collectives. Networks overlap or consolidate to form larger networks, such as governments and institutions. They are not single entities, and they have no center. This makes them unstable and potentially vulnerable to confrontation and resistance. Although the goal is network stability, networks must constantly reconfigure to respond to outside challenges. Ant borrows the term black box from cybernetics to describe a knowledge network that has been collectively stabilized, when its validity is no longer questioned, when it is accepted as a fact that is available to advance further knowledge. For example, the microscope has a history, a network of actors that contributed to its emergence as a tool to advance science. But nobody bothers to question the knowledge behind the microscope when they use one. Nobody questions the theory of optics or magnification. It is simply taken for granted that the thing will do as expected, make little things look bigger, so the microscope is said to be black-boxed. Before black boxes get closed, or when they are reopened, controversy arises. This is what ANT researchers are interested in, how controversies flare up and get settled, how relationships form between actors to stabilize and protect the network from confrontation and resistance. And for the purposes of this talk, we can consider evolution black-boxed and creationism and ID as attempts to open up the box to create controversy. Or more accurately, a manufactureversy, which Lee Ciccarelli defines as, quote, a manufactured controversy that is motivated by profit or extreme ideology to intentionally create public confusion about an issue that is not in dispute. Ant relies on the concept of translation, which means, according to sociologist John Law, to make two worlds equivalent. That is, to take a concept and make it understandable to those outside the network to advance its expansion. And this is essentially what science communicators like Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, and the late Carl Sagan, among others, do. They translate the technical language of science into plain language most of us can understand, even children sometimes. They act as spokespersons for the network of science. Because the science versus religion debate is a long-standing one with a rich history of empirical, philosophical, and theological argumentation, network convergence between the two worlds of science and religion was not the anticipated outcome. Instead, the debate can be understood as a potential site of consolidation, an opportunity to mobilize the audience and define their roles as agents for social change. The rhetorical situation of a live broadcast debate poses a number of constraints, including temporal. Unlike engaging with a text, where time allows for contemplation prior to responding, live debates demand the ability to predict one's opponent's objections in advance and to respond on demand. Moving along to the rhetorical analysis of the debates, there is much to be said about the ethos and pathos of the debaters I've chosen to focus on: Ken Ham, William Lane Craig, and Deepak Chopra. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus on logos, the content of their claims. I'm beginning with what I refer to as low-hanging fruit. Ken Ham. Ham is the president of Answers in Genesis and founder of the Creation Museum located in Kentucky. Except this facility, as Bill and I referred to it during the debate, isn't a museum at all. It's basically a theme park based on a literal interpretation of the biblical book of Genesis, depicting a 6,000-year-old Earth where humans and vegetarian dinosaurs frolicked. Recently, they added the Ark Encounter exhibit, purported to be a life-size replica of Noah's Ark. The facility has drawn critical attention not only from the scientific community, as well as skeptics and secularists who have protested the tax incentives and the ready-made audience of school children sent there on field trips. It has also attracted the ire of Christians who reject the young earth model. Even televangelist Pat Robertson chided him, stating, quote, "There ain't no way that's possible. To say that it all came about in 6,000 years is just nonsense, and I think it's time we come off of that stuff and say it just isn't possible. Let's be real. Let's not make a joke of ourselves." It's useful at this point to introduce the creation-evolution continuum, developed by Eugenie Scott, former executive director of the National Center for Science Education, a not-for-profit, quote, dedicated to keeping evolution and climate change in the science classroom and to keeping creationism and climate change denial out. Kim Ham would fall into the young earth creationism range, whereas Pat Robertson would fit within the theistic evolution area. The debate took place on February 4th, 2014 at the Creation Facility, moderated by CNN journalist Tom Foreman and broadcast live online, drawing an estimated audience of 3 million during broadcast time. The topic of debate was, is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? Ham deployed many standard creationist strategies, like positioning evolution as a theory in crisis by manufacturing doubt about the fossil record, geological data, radiometric dating, and so on. And as a first speaker, he attempted to frame the debate by distinguishing observational from historical science. This is a recent and emergent rhetorical strategy among the creationism repertoire, presumably crafted to help unify their narrative. It is difficult to satisfactorily define observational and historical science, and indeed obfuscating the discussion with vaguely defined terms is consistent with the rhetorical strategies used to deploy manufactoriversies. However, according to Ham, observational science pertains to how we use science to produce technology, and it is not contentious among mainstream and creation scientists. Historical science, though, pertains to how we interpret evidence to explain the natural world. Creationists are willing to admit they have preconceived ideas about how the universe began and how life came into being, and these ideas inform how they interpret evidence. According to Ham, nobody was there to observe the past except the Creator, whose word is infallible. The evidence supports a literal interpretation of Genesis, and explanations that do not accord with the Bible are materialistic and must be rejected as bad science. Conflating science with secularism and deploying strategic catchphrases, Ham accused secularists of hijacking the words science and evolution in a bait-and-switch tactic, and asserted that secularists do not want creationists to expose the distinction between observational and historical science, because it would mean admitting their interpretation of evidence is guided by a godless religion. According to Ham, secularists are indoctrinating children instead of teaching them to think critically, and it is creationists who ought to be teaching them the right way to think about science. Dr. William Lane Craig is regarded as the poster boy of Christian apologetics. Craig is a theologian and prominent debater on the topic of the existence of God. He is the author of Reasonable Faith and established an online ministry of the same name. He is also a fellow of the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture, the group I referred to earlier, who promote intelligent design. The debate between Craig and author and journalist Christopher Hitchens occurred on April 4th, 2009 at Biola University, moderated by Hugh Hewitt, professor of law at Chapman University School of Law and conservative Catholic radio talk show host, and the topic was, does God exist? Craig argued, quote, first, that there's no good argument that atheism is true, and secondly, that there are good arguments that theism is true. Atheists have tried for centuries to disprove the existence of God, but no one's ever been able to come up with a successful argument. So rather than attack straw men at this point, I'll just wait to hear Mr. Hitchens present his arguments against God's existence, and then I'll respond to them in my next speech, unquote. Craig proceeded with 5 arguments to support his claim that theism, is more reasonable than atheism. The cosmological argument, the teleological, or argument from design, the moral argument, the resurrection of Jesus, and the immediate experience of God. All of these are interesting arguments, but I want to focus on the first two. The Kalam cosmological argument stems from medieval Islamic theology and follows a very simple logical structure. If A, then B. A, therefore B. In this structure, the truth of the premises is guaranteed. The truth of the conclusion is guaranteed by the truth of the premises. The cosmological argument can be stated as follows. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. The teleological argument rests on the idea that design is evident in nature, therefore there must be a designer. The argument can be traced back to Socrates via the Philebus dialogue presented in Plato's The Republic, if not further, and it has a long history of being deployed by theologians defending the Abrahamic faiths. Some of you might recognize it as the watchmaker analogy, which was presented by the English theologian William Paley, who speaks of a hypothetical watch found on the beach. Quote, when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried out in the machine, or none which could have answered the use that is now served by it. The inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it to actually answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Finally, author Jean Houston and New Age guru, physician, and alternative medicine quack Deepak Chopra debated science historian and skeptic Michael Shermer and neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris. This episode of ABC's Nightline Face-Off was filmed at Caltech, hosted by anchor Dan Harris, and broadcast on March 23, 2010. Chopra has long been accused by skeptics of stating profound-sounding but meaningless claims, and he didn't disappoint. When asked by the anchor what scientific proof he had to back up his claims, Chopra responded, quote, I think science, again in deference to Sam Harris, he said, don't go the way of quantum physics. I think I'm going to have to say that science is now in a process of overthrowing the climactic overthrow of the superstition of materialism, that everything that we call matter comes from something that is not material, that the essential nature of the physical world, that it's not physical, that the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff, call it what you will. And science also tells us that nature is a discontinuity, that it's an ono phenomenon, that there are gaps between every two worlds, where you find a field of possibilities, a field of pure potentiality. Science doesn't call it God, but what is God if not the immeasurable potential of all that was, all that is, and all that will be? Science also tells us that there's a field of non-locality where everything is correlated with everything else. My adversaries are going to point out, no, everything God is explained by neurology. Well, I hope today, Michael, that you will convert from a skeptic to a neuroskeptic, because your science is really frozen in the dungeons of conservatism and the dungeons of orthodoxy. Today, science tells us that the essential nature of reality is non-local correlation. Everything is connected to everything else, that there's hidden creativity, there are quantum leaps of creativity, that there's something called the observer effect, where intention orchestrates space-time events, which we then measure as movements and motion and energy and matter. And addressing Sam, we can have a personal relationship with this intelligence because we have a consciousness, and this part of the sea of consciousness, All you have to do is understand the principles of science and understand that within you, you have the resources to intuitively grasp this mystery. But one of the things we have to do today is that you have to stop being the jihadists in the Vatican of conservative and orthodox science, which is not relevant anymore. Chopra is as critical of dogmatic religions as he is of science, and on his definition of God, nothing can be excluded. God, on this view, is everywhere. So what can we learn from these very different approaches to advancing creationism and intelligent design? According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a presupposition is, quote, the phenomenon whereby speakers mark linguistically the information that is presupposed or taken for granted, rather than being part of the main propositional content of a speech act. William Lane Craig uses the phrase properly basic beliefs, which are, to quote him, part of the foundation of a person's system of beliefs. Other properly basic beliefs include the belief in the reality of the external world, the belief in the existence of the past and the presence of other minds like your own. For Craig, the existence of the Christian God is a properly basic belief, linguistically marking it as equivalent to a belief in material reality. Thus, in his opening statement, he is able to shift the burden of proof onto Hitch, who, like the other opposing debaters under analysis, concede that a negative claim cannot be proven nor empirically tested. As a trained philosopher, Craig knows that this is a logical fallacy. The onus rests on the one asserting the positive claim, and unless empirical evidence can be brought to bear to support that claim, it remains within the realm of ideas. Schirmer acknowledges this, but nevertheless presents a compelling case against the Christian God of the Bible, concluding that given that the plethora of religions spanning human history, they cannot all be right, and as human artifacts, they are all very likely to be incorrect. All three of our apologists misrepresent science to varying degrees. Ham attempts to fit scientific findings to a literal reading of Genesis by drawing a false distinction between observational and historical science, and Craig draws on theoretical cosmology, using evidence of the Big Bang, suggesting evidence of the Big Bang indicates a creator, rather than acknowledging that its cause is the subject of a vigorous ongoing research program. The fine-tuning argument falls within the teleological framework, the gist of which is that the laws of nature are fine-tuned to support life, that God planned it that way for us mere human mortals. But from what we currently understand, the vast majority of the universe, and even much of our own planet, is uninhabitable. Regardless, we have no other observable universe with which to compare our own, so the fine-tuning argument remains a speculative hypothesis that cannot be empirically tested. Refusing to accept "we don't know" as an answer, Craig instead offers up God and evades questions about God's origins by claiming God is, quote, an uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial being of unfathomable power. Moreover, it must be personal as well. This is the cause, he asserts in his appropriation of the Kalam cosmological argument. To quote Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and Hitch, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Whatever the cause of the universe, the scientific evidence Craig offers fails to support his conclusion that the Christian God was its cause. Ham not only misrepresents science, he conflates it with secularism, the belief that church and state ought to be separate, which he further conflates with atheism, then accuses secularists of hijacking science to indoctrinate children with atheism. And Chopra's appropriation of the language of quantum physics is nothing short of nonsensical, or as Schirmer graciously put it, his claims are meaningless. In a recent study entitled On the Reception and Detection of Pseudo-Profound Bullshit, Gordon Pennycock and his colleagues reported that, quote, across multiple studies, the propensity to judge bullshit statements as profound was associated with a variety of conceptually relevant variables. For example, intuitive cognitive style, supernatural belief. These results support the idea, that was the end of the quote. These results support the idea that some people No, I'm sorry, it's not the end of the quote. That some people are more receptive to this type of bullshit, and that detecting it is not merely a matter of indiscriminate skepticism, but rather a discernment of deceptive vagueness in otherwise impressive-sounding claims. Our results also suggest that a bias toward accepting statements as true may be an important component of pseudo-profound bullshit receptivity. In other words, many are susceptible to bullshit if it's made to sound profound, and indeed, the researchers used some of Chopra's tweets to test their hypothesis. So how can we take what we've learned about apologetics to help defend and advance the network of science? First, be mindful of your audience. Formal debates like the one I've discussed here differ from the context of our everyday lives. Debaters must be prepared to respond to questions in real time. Most of us don't have widespread audiences, but when we chance upon apologetics claims in our everyday lives or on social media, we have an opportunity to engage our listeners and mobilize them as agents for social change. Second, argue ethically and responsibly. Although pseudo-profound bullshit is rhetorically appealing, avoid claims that cannot be supported with empirical evidence, or make the distinction between science and philosophy. Finally, beware of presuppositions and the conflation of the discourses of philosophy and science. Challenge those claims that are not empirically supported. One method of accomplishing this is to engage in Socratic dialogue, which involves questioning the claimant to expose logical fallacies like the ones committed by our apologist. And that concludes my talk. I'd like to thank you very much for attending, and I would be happy to address any questions that anybody might have.